My name is Shahenda Helmi, and I'm the Director of Literary Programs at the Penn Faulkner Foundation, and I'm so excited to welcome you all here tonight for Transitional Writing. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Penn Faulkner Foundation is a literary nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., with a mission of celebrating literature and fostering connections between readers and writers to enrich and inspire both individuals and communities. We fulfill our mission by administering 2 national literary awards, the Penn Faulkner Award for Fiction and the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in the Short Story, as well as through our education programs, which bring free books and author visits to DC public and public charter schools. If you'd like to learn more about the work we do, please visit our website at pennfaulkner.org and follow us on social media. Before I introduce and bring on tonight's amazing panelists, I want to mention a few technical notes about tonight's webinar. There will be live captions provided this evening. To turn them on and off, you can use the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There will also be a brief Q&A session at the end of the event, so please submit your questions using the Q&A panel. You can also upvote your favorite questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. You can also find our panelists' books on sale through Politics and Prose through the links that we'll provide in the chat shortly. Be sure to check them out. All right, it's time to get this conversation started. I'm very honored to introduce tonight's panelists who have so graciously taken the time to join us from all over the United States and the world, the joy of virtual events. First up, we have Zeyn Joukhadar, who is the author of The 30 Names of Night, which won the Lambda Literary Award and the Stonewall Book Award. He is also the author of The Map of Salt and Stars, which won the Middle East Book Award and was a finalist for the Goodreads Choice Awards and the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize. His work has appeared in the Kink Anthology, Salon, the Paris Review, Pank, and elsewhere, and has been twice nominated for the Pushcart Prize. Joukhadar serves on the board of the Radius of Arab American Writers and mentors emerging writers of color with the Paraplus Collective. Next up, we have Torrey Peters, who is the author of the best-selling novel Detransition Baby, which was a finalist for the 2021 National Book Critics Circle Award for the John Leonard Prize, longlisted for the Women's Prize, and was a Roxane Gay's Audacious Book Club pick. She is also the author of the novellas Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones and The Masker. Peters holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and a master's in comparative literature from Dartmouth. She splits her time between Brooklyn and an off-grid cabin in Vermont. Also joining us tonight is Neon Yang, the author of the Tenzorit series of novellas from Tor.com Publishing, which includes The Red Threads of Fortune, The Black Tides of Heaven, The Descent of Monsters, and The Ascent to Godhood. Their work has been shortlisted for the Hugo, Nebula, Lambda Literary, and World Fantasy Awards, and their debut novel, The Genesis of Misery, will be published by Tor in September of 2022, so be sure to look out for that. Finally, moderating tonight's conversation is the amazing P. Carl, who is the author of the memoir, Becoming a Man, The Story of a Transition. His work has been published in the New York Times Magazine, the Boston Globe Magazine, and LitHub. He is currently working on the stage adaptation of Becoming a Man, which was commissioned by American Repertory Theater. Carl received a bachelor's degree in English literature and a master's in peace studies from the University of Notre Dame, and holds a PhD in comparative studies in discourse and society from the University of Minnesota. He was born in Elkhart, Indiana, and now lives in Boston with his spouse, the writer Lynette D'Amico, and their dogs, Lenny Obama and Sunny. All right, that is it from me. Thank you all again for being a part of tonight's exciting and important conversation. Carl, please take it away.
Thank you, Shahenda. Thank you so much for having me and us, and to Penn Faulkner. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I hope my dogs will not bark, is what we will hope. Yeah, I mean, I guess we'll jump into some questions, and the one thing I would say is preparing for this and reading I'd read your books, but kind of getting back into them. If I had to pick 3 books that were completely unalike, I might pick the 3 of yours together. So that was sort of fun. So I thought what we might do is just put the energy of the work into the room at the start. And the way I thought we might do that is that the worlds you create are all incredibly different, culturally, racially, ethnically, and transly, which is a word I've just created. They're different in all of those ways. And so I just wonder if you would talk about kind of the the origins of those worlds, and then as you're thinking about the world, either you could read a little section from your book first, or you could talk about the world and then read after, however you want to do that. And maybe Zeyn, you'd start if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm super excited to be here with you all. This is awesome. Yeah, I think I can talk a little bit and then read a little bit if that works. I think when I was thinking about creating the world of the book for 30 Names of Night, I think I was first of all, I was kind of focused across time because there's two timelines. There's a section that's in this neighborhood of New York that still exists, but in a very different way now. There's only a few buildings left, but this historic neighborhood, let's say, of Little Syria in the 30s and 40s. And then there's like a contemporary timeline of characters that are in the same, obviously the same city in New York City, but are living completely different lives and have a completely different relationship to the city. But I was still, in both timelines, I'm still focused on what it is like now and was like then to be Syrian American, to be Arab in New York, and to be queer and or trans in that community, in that place, even though both timelines span so much time. And so I think I was just trying to focus on, what was possible, what was probable, based on the research I did, where I could fill in the gaps in the archive, in a way that that would have been recognizable to the people I was writing about both in the 30s and 40s, and also something that the characters in the contemporary timeline were able to connect with in terms of either their own ancestors, in a similar way for me, connecting with folks that could have been my own ancestors, whether in America or in Syria, and just on focusing on those relationships, both across time and then within the timelines. So I think it was really based in people for me. And the section I was going to read for tonight is just a super, super short section from the middle where that kind of talks about some of this in terms of the contemporary timeline and the relationships between the characters in the contemporary timeline. The main character, for things you need to know, the main character is a non-binary person who is in the process of choosing his new name, and so is unnamed for most of the book. And in this particular scene, he is sort of dragged out dancing by a friend named Sami, on whom he also has a crush, but Sami doesn't know this. Sami is also, to the best of the narrator's knowledge, cis and gay, and so there's some tension there with the main character wondering if the crush is going to be returned or not, and also because the character is a lot of these characters are queer and or trans and also Muslim and either Arab or Swana, Southwest Asian and North African. A lot of the relationships are also sort of these intra-communal relationships and are specific in those kinds of ways. And maybe the best way to talk about that is just to read the excerpt. Okay. All right. The DJ turns the music down, and the room stills to listen. Even over the bass beat, the sound of the Asha Azan next door is loud enough to make itself heard. The DJ has lowered the music out of respect, so that the call to prayer becomes part of the music. The room continues to dance as though this is simply another rhythm to move one's body to. Once, a friend of yours from Marrakesh played us a recording of the Azan from the streets of the old Medina. She said it reminded her that no matter what she was worrying about, life was fleeting, and one day none of the fears that plagued her would matter at all. I always liked that about the Azan, that a sound could both remind me that I was going to die and comfort me with the reminder that I was still alive, that it could remind me of the ways my ancestors touched their foreheads to the earth, that a single sound could tap that ancient place in my bones and make it sing like a plucked string. The last time I went to the masjid with you is as alive as though it is still happening. It is Ashura and I'm fasting. It is a hot day. I put on my abaya, wrap my hijab, and walk with you up the stairs to the women's room. I take off my sandals and set them in the cubby, and inside the carpet meets my hungry toes. The women burst into the room like eagles, faces bright, their abayat emerald and night black and pomegranate. Half of the women who greet me look like Teta, like the woman I am supposed to one day become. Assalamu alaikum, we say to one another as women arrange themselves in rows for prayer. Wa alaikum assalam. We recite and bow our heads and turn to our angels on either side. Then the day is gone, and we break our fast behind closed doors, where teenage girls whip off their hijabs and laugh, sequester themselves from their mothers, tell dirty jokes, oil their fingers with turmeric chicken. Bismillah, we say, and eat until we are full. In those days, as out of place as I felt in the world, I would have dared anyone to tell me we were anything less than our own feast. I haven't prayed since the day they slid you into the earth. Your grave faces a copse of pines that separates the cemetery from the homes of rich families who don't want to see the dead and the grieving. We buried not a person but a continent that day. We're made from clay after all, aren't we? And underground springs and threads of copper run in our veins. When this country asks me where I'm from, they aren't asking for the city on my birth certificate, but whose earth is in my blood. Then the azan is over and I'm swimming in the music. I paint the space around me with my body. I think of the last time I used my hands to make something beautiful. As long as my body was not for myself, I stopped allowing myself the luxury of wanting. But here in this space that smells of sweat and sage and cigarette smoke, anything seems possible, even desire. Sami curves his back, his knees, his neck. He is beautiful, and I am still in love with him, and this is not a mistake. I bend and untangle and step out of my body, lightening myself into this swollen room where boys like me are arcing and vaulting our unruly bodies, shaking the wet newness from our wings. I'll stop there.
Great. Love that. I love that passage and the image. Deanne, would you maybe go next and do the same? Talk about the world and read a little?
Okay, I might do something slightly different in that I will talk about the world and read a little and then talk a little bit more about it. Basically, I'm reading from my first novella, The Black Tides of Heaven, which is part of the 10 Threads series. So I wrote 2 novellas that were released at the same time, which was The Black Tides of Heaven and The Red Threads of Fortune. And technically, this was the second book that I wrote. But when I created this world, it's secondary world fantasy. But I wanted to write the kind of fantasy that I knew growing up, which was like sort of like very Asian inspired, journey to the West kind of fantasy. And so that is what I created with this world. As an Asian, it's sort of like infused secondary world fantasy. And the first 2 books the first 2 books explore the lives of a pair of twins who are like the children of the supreme ruler of the little empire called Akeha and Mokuya. And in this world, children are not assigned gender at birth, and they have to, at some point in their childhood or teenagehood, the adolescence, that was the word I was looking for, they have to choose a gender. Unfortunately, in this world, they're kind of very binary, so they have to pick a binary gender. And so this is this excerpt that I'm reading is from Black Tides of Heaven, where Akiha, one of the twins, has had a revelation after realizing that their twin Mokuya has chosen to be assigned a woman. And I'm just going to read from it now. Akeha walked and walked. The diplomatic wing had a courtyard of its own, an austere stone garden with an enormous black plant sitting in its middle. The plant was a work of art titled Reflections upon the Past and the Future. Its ebony surface was polished to glass-like smoothness and lit by a dozen sunballs fixed to the ground. Standing in front of its massive bulk, Akeha's reflection was superimposed over a void so pure and deep, it seemed unending. Akeha stared at themselves, the shorn head, the genderless robes, the stark facial features that were identical to Mokuya's. Until a young person confirmed their gender, the masters of forest nature kept the markers of adulthood at bay. They had never imagined themselves any other way. It frightened them to think that this was not true for Mokuya. A fundamental chasm had opened between them through which many other things could slip. Their inner voice whispered conspiratorially, but that chasm's always been there. You've always known about it. Okay, yeah. They stared unblinking at their own face as they recited feminine pronouns like a sutra. I am, I want, I will. And like a sutra, the words came out of their mouths rote and meaningless. There was no connection between what was said and the person in the black mirror. Akiha bit their lip. A thought occurred to them. In all honesty, it had been occurring to them for some time and occurring with much greater frequency since Mokuya's announcement 2 nights ago. It was a thought that took hold in the back of their mind whenever they look at Thanjay, at the shape of his body underneath his clothes, a thought that they had been trying to drown out, to ignore. Slowly, as if stepping into the unilluminated edge of a lake, Akiha switched to using masculine pronouns. I am, I want, I will. Their heart quickened in their chest. The words rolled and clicked in their mind, sharp and electric. I want, I want, I want. Akiha had not grown up again amongst men. There were male monks, to be sure, but they were not men as Kwanjin society considered men. There were no men in the protector's family, and few amongst those she allowed close to her. Men were creatures of distant fascination with their broad backs and tan cheeks, and Akiha had never considered that they might be one of them. They imagined themselves dressing up like a man, with their hair tied up like a man. It felt different, not right exactly, but there was something there. I want, I want, I am. So an interesting thing about this novella was that I came out as non-binary after writing it, because part of writing like Akiha's experience was what made me realize that I was not as cis as I thought I was. So that I think like whenever I read excerpts of this book, I always tend to read this particular passage because I think it has that sort of significance for me, where I was just like, this was sort of a gender awakening for me as well. So yeah.
That's great. I like you wrote yourself right into yourself, which is kind of cool. Torrey, go ahead.
So I wrote Detransition Baby, and I think I'll just start by reading it, but just a little like elevator pitch for it is it's the story of Reese, who you can think of as sort of like Fleabag, but trans and in Brooklyn. She's a mess. She's sleeping with married guys. And the action of the book kicks off when her ex, Ames, who used to be a trans woman named Amy, but detransitioned, approaches Reese with the news that Ames has gotten his boss, Katrina, pregnant, and would they like to make an unconventional family together? And I realize that sounds like a lot, it's really convoluted, but actually that's just the first chapter. So I'll just like start from the beginning and just read the first page. The question for Reese: were married men just desperately attractive to her, or was the pool of men who were available to her as a trans woman only those who had already locked down a cis wife and could now explore with her? The easy answer, the one that all her girls advocated, was to call men dogs. But now here's Reese sneaking around with another handsome, charming motherfucking cheater. Look at her, wearing a black lace dress and sitting in his parked Beamer, waiting while he goes into a Dwayne Reed to buy condoms. Then she's going to let him come over to her apartment, avoid the pointed glare of her roommate Iris, and have him fuck her right on the trite floral bedspread that the last married dude bought her, so that her room would seem a little more girly and naughty when he snuck away from his wife. Reese had already diagnosed her own problem. She didn't know how to be alone. She fled from her own company, from her own solitude. Along with telling her how awful her cheating men were, her friends also told her that after 2 major breakups, she needed time to learn to be herself by herself. She couldn't be alone in any kind of moderate way. Give her a week to herself and she began to isolate, cultivating an ash of loneliness until she was daydreaming about selling everything and drifting away on a boat towards nowhere. To jolt herself back to life, she went on Grindr or Tinder or wherever and administered 10,000 volts to the heart by chasing the most dramatic tachycardia of an affair she could find. Married men were the best for fleeing loneliness because married men also didn't know how to be alone. Married men were experts at being together, at not letting go, no matter what, until death do us part. Her married man this time was similar to her others, only this man was better because he was an HIV positive cowboy turned lawyer. He had a thing for trans girls and had seroconverted while cheating on his wife with a trans woman, and the wife had stayed with him, and now he was back at it again with Reese. So that's the first page. And let's see, why did I kind of write it? I was writing it because I was on the far side of transition, and I really felt like as a trans woman, the opportunities or the horizon of possibility for me was different than the generation that came before me. And I was looking around and I was like, all right, well, I did a transition. Now how do I live? And, you know, the generation before me, their models were kind of survival. And actually for me, I felt like I had, you know, that more possibilities. But as a result, those other women were like, well, we don't know. We were just trying to survive. We don't know how to make a life. And the great thing about fiction is that it like kind of works as a test case. Like you don't actually have to go into the coal mine yourself. You can like create a character and send them in and be like, what happens if you do this? And in one of the things that I think it was most difficult or most sort of like, can I do this? Is it possible? Is the idea of being a mother as a trans woman. How could it happen? What would it mean? How, you know, where how do you make those kind of negotiations? And you know, rather than I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I was like, rather than doing this myself, I'll have Reese do it. she can figure it out. And then at the end of the book, maybe I'll have some answers. And yeah, that's basically it.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, let's pick up a little bit on that question of generation, you know, mostly because like last week I was called an elder 3 times, and so I'm preoccupied with it at this point. It's never happened before, and then it happened 3 times. But this generational question, I think you're all dealing with that in your books, and I just wonder. I mean, Torrey, you gave us some insight, and maybe if Neon and Zeyn, you have some thoughts about that as well. How you're thinking about it and how you're maneuvering it in terms of your writing. Take it. Neon, I think you're up.
Oh, am I? So no, I was just waiting for people to start talking. It's interesting because I think one of the things for me is that I am an elder millennial, a geriatric millennial, and but I'm fairly new to the concept of transness because growing up, I didn't really have or like, you know, models for being not one or the other, because for a really long time, it was very difficult for me to consider myself transgender because I was like, well, I don't identify with being a man. I don't want to be a dude. So I think it's very different now, I think, for people growing up, because when I was like, you know, a child in the 90s, there was no such talk about people being like, you know, non-binary or whatever. And it was a revelation for me in my mid-30s that, oh, I actually don't have to be the gender that I was assigned at birth. And it's still a very new experience to me, and I'm still learning and still negotiating sort of like my position with respect to gender. And yeah, I think part of it is, you know, although I kind of came through to this realization through writing. I have started to realize that this is much more personal, and it's not really something that I also personally want to explore in my fiction. So it's actually honestly a thing that I'm sort of moving away from writing about these days, just because like I think it's my personal journey. I don't really know where I'm at. Everything's very messy, and but you know, if I have figured out something, I will put it in a book. But otherwise, I kind of don't want to do that kind of self figuring out in public. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's always the trick of writing in any context, right? So what are you revealing about yourself, and what are you, or what do people think you're revealing about yourself, I guess, especially in fiction. Yeah, and obviously, Zeyn, your book is a lot about this question of generation and exploration, and again, just kind of the insights you had in terms of that question, writing it, and what you, you know, what you, why you were compelled to go back, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny because I know a lot of other like trans Arabs and trans Muslims. I mean, I'm really lucky in the sense that I really do feel that I have a whole community of folks very much like me, in the sense of having models of possibility and that sort of thing. Not to say that I grew up having that, but I have that now. But that said, like, I definitely still get a lot of reactions from, especially from white cis folks, about like this idea that somehow my existence or our existence is like a contradiction in terms, or somehow is new, or to write historically about the existence of people like me is somehow an anachronism or somehow impossible. And being, you know, somebody who has maybe always been, long before I knew that I was trans, has always been hungry for models of possibility, and knowing that like other people passed the way that I've passed, that I'm passing now. It's always been important to me. And so I think, you know, even with my first book, I was writing sort of across timelines and trying to make connections to things that are happening now, to things that have happened before. Just because I think that it's, you know, one of the ways that we survive is to know that other people have survived the things that we're going through, even if it's just in some shade or sense of what's happening now. So I think that was what kind of drove me into the archives at first, was to say, you know, maybe I won't find explicit evidence of what I'm looking for, but maybe I'll find the possibility, enough space where a person like that could have fit. And just this sort of empty space will be enough for me to know that even if I don't find, you know, a sort of a sign saying, look, here I am, of someone using the exact same language or the exact same terms that I would use now, I'll still know that they existed, because of course they did in some fashion. I just want to know how they survived. I want to try to imagine what a person like that, what their life might have been like. And that was kind of what I did with the past timeline in 30 Names of Night. And I think that from that, I was able to, you know, maybe I didn't find all the answers that I was looking for, but I at least found a sense that, okay, you know, it was certainly more than possible that someone else passed this way before. And that makes me feel just a little bit more confident in my ability to survive what I'm going through now, and to know that, you know, also for people that are coming after me, people that are coming after us, that they'll be able to do the same thing and make a life.
Yeah, I think that it's that thing I often hear my students saying, you know, who are like role models of like how do I know I will survive, because they're looking like out, you know, forward. And I think in many ways you have to go back at this moment. At some point, there'll be more forward out there. So it's very interesting. Yeah, and I guess, you know, thinking too, as and with all of your books, is because they really have such a a different sensibility and all in really beautiful ways. And I was listening to an interview you did, Torrey, about moving to Brooklyn to be part of the trans version of the Harlem Renaissance, which I thought was, I wondered if it had happened yet, but I was curious. But you said some interesting things about how writing with other, I believe trans women, but maybe other trans women was really had a huge impact in terms of how you thought about the book versus had you, just been by yourself and not in this group of people writing together.
Totally. Well, we came, I came to the scene after it already started. It was sort of a small scene in Brooklyn in around 2013, 2014, centered around this press, Topside Press, that was publishing only trans people. It was run by trans people. But I think more than just the production, the question was, it was a change in the lens, the change in the idea of the audience. And this is something that I think we took from other minority groups that had gone through stages of literature, where you heard about writers like Toni Morrison, who stated, in her Nobel Prize speech that she writes explicitly for Black women, and that and that everybody else can basically keep up. And we were like, well, all these other great writers are doing it. Let's write really only for other trans people. And this sounds like a political project, but actually it's an artistic one. Because what happens when you assume a trans audience is, when you're assuming a cis audience, you explain things. So it might be like 70% story, 30% explanation. But when you've got a trans audience, it's 100% story. So the actual quality of your writing changes. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened is, when you assume a trans audience, you have to bring a higher level of insight. So if I told like you all about hormones, you would be bored. You would yawn at me. You'd be like, great, yeah, we do it every week. So for me, that doesn't mean though that I can't talk about hormones. It means that if I'm going to talk about hormones with you, I need to bring an insight that you haven't thought about yourself. I need to say something to you all about hormones that you haven't experienced. And that's just a much higher bar to clear. And so imagining that trans audience actually just makes me a better writer. And the thing is, people are like, well, can cis people keep up? And in fact, I don't think cis people are stupid. I think cis people can keep up. And that if I bring a higher level of insight, guess what? Cis people benefit. So the idea of audience was like really what kind of shaped that scene. And part of it was that we had our own press. So we weren't thinking about, or in my case, I self-published. I wasn't thinking about the needs of the market in terms of what comps were, what had sold before. And slowly, we sort of, I think our theory was proven out in the fact that a lot of really great writers came from that scene, even as the scene itself imploded because there was scarcity and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, so that was sort of the animating philosophy of that scene. And now I think, going on almost a decade, it's been borne out in the work that we've produced, and the fact that trans audience translates very easily into a cis audience, the same way that Toni Morrison's work translates into an audience of all races.
Yeah, I think that was the interesting thing about reading your book, is that the effort not to accommodate cis people actually accommodated cis people. Like because it got to, they could relate to, attraction, affairs, I mean, it was all the things, so I found that really fascinating in terms of how that emerged.
Yeah, I was interested in creating affinity, across these differences. And part of the ways that you create affinity, I think, in fiction is through technique. So if you give somebody a story that never stops, they'll come with you, and they'll come with you across all sorts of differences.
And I think that's, it's interesting because of the ways that you're all writing in different genres. I was thinking, Neon, for you, like you're in that sort of cross of like sci-fi fantasy. And I missed the dinosaur era. I have students who are really into dinosaurs, but I totally missed that. But there's dinosaurs, but there's also this sense of this technical world. And so your audience also is very much into I was watching some interviews and the adoration of your the worlds that you're creating in terms of sci-fi and then fantasy combined. And I just wondered about your how you bring those two together, and then sort of how you're weaving these bigger questions into those future type worlds that you're creating.
Yeah, that's a whole thing, in that like I tend to write stuff that confuses or like blurs the line between genres as we tend to think them in science fiction and fantasy, mostly because my brain is very unruly. It thinks of things and it doesn't think about like boxes to put it into, which is like what publishing wants, because they want to be able to market a book as a science fiction or fantasy to the right readers of one or the other. But to me, it's all kind of like one space that's like fantastical and like speculative fiction. And when I create worlds or I think of things, I don't generally put a distinction between them. Personally, for me, I came from a science background. I was like a science student through my entire life, and basically told I was too stupid to do humanities because, like, I was not good enough at English and stuff like that. And because I grew up very working class, so it like literature was something that I came into in my later years. So I always blend, I think, like science and fantasy, and because to me it's like I have a scientific background, so I tend to write science fiction, but I also am very bored with a lot of science fiction, and I want stuff like magic and stuff just happening. So I always combine the two. I put into my books whatever I want, and yeah. I do. I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, I mean, you're answering the question. I think weaving that in, and the people that I mean, do you feel like that also so the audience is broader? It's not. I mean, there is this weird way in which a trans book is a trans book. Like I remember like the publishers all scheduling my book tour in queer bookstores, and I thought, why only queer bookstore? I totally didn't understand that at all, And so I'm curious in terms of your work, how it it moves past that, because there's also this whole subculture of people who are reading the kind of this intersection of sci-fi and fantasy. So.
Yeah, I think it also ties in a bit to what Torrey was saying, in that, like, you write a book for a certain audience, but the other audiences can also keep up. And publishing is a business, and like they need to be able to market stuff because they want to know like what audience the book sells to and whatever. But also I think that like people would benefit from reading more from like categories that they don't naturally read. So I was always like, yeah, I think you will have an ideal audience in your head, and maybe most of the time it will be an audience that's someone like you, because sometimes you just write books for yourself, but then like you will be often surprised to find like how large a population of people who also will enjoy your book that you did not imagine enjoying, I think.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, like I said, it was fun to watch the videos because the geekdom about sci-fi, which I love. There was that real. I mean, the enthusiasm for that, I think, is its own thing, and then the way in which gender works in the books is a different thing, but also connected. So it's cool. And then I mean, so I had a really hard time not like reaching out to you, Zeyn, as I was reading your book, because I'm a bird fanatic. I like bird, like I bird like 4 hours a day, almost every day, and do bird photography. And so I started reading your book. I'm like, no way, it's like ornithologist. Like so I'd like to just, if we could just stop and you and I just talk about birds for a couple days, and but what you do so well in the book is, I think, you're really very fluidly mixing this very urban space around these very urban issues, and then with this natural world that is real and not real, and sometimes it's more real, sometimes it's less real. And I just thought that I just wondered if you might talk a little bit about both how where birds came from, just because I need to know, and then also just how that weaving felt for you, and why that was such an important part of how you told the story.
Well, first of all, I love anytime that I meet someone else who's obsessed with birds. So someone who understands my heart. I mean, a lot of my work has kind of always had fabulous elements in it, you could say, pretty prominently. And also, I think that the birds, in a very specific way in this book, were the start maybe of kind of a larger obsession that is still kind of developing for me, with like non-human or supernatural forces, and particularly the ways in which the natural world is very much alive and communicative in a way that it doesn't usually, it's not usually portrayed as such, let's say, in a lot of like the Western literary canon, or even just the way that that at least in the United States, and let's just say that at least in the United States, we're not usually sort of taught to think about the natural world as being alive in that way, or present to us in that way. But also, I was going into the book with a very specific thematic desire, I guess you could say, to talk about the sacred, and the search for the sacred as a trans person, and especially the search for the sacred within one's own body. And this is something that I was trying to find a way to talk about even before I knew that birds were going to be in the book at all. And throughout the book, there's actually a lot of mentions are sort of woven in of this, I guess what you could call a sort of like a Sufi epic poem, a sort of sacred work called The Conference of the Birds, that talks about the search for God, the search for the divine. That there's a great translation into English actually by Scholle Volpe that's really, really excellent. That I had read, and it's even quoted in the book a little bit. But essentially, the character, being trans and Muslim, is looking for the sacred, and pretty much all the characters in the book are doing the same thing in their own way. And the birds sort of weave in and out as a symbol for that search, in a way that sort of sometimes borrows from or sometimes touches on that poem, The Conference of the Birds, in the sense that, like, in the poem, the birds are they want to find their like king or leader, and one of the birds suggests that they find the simur, which is, we could have a discussion about a lot of the sort of deeper symbology in this, but the birds go looking for the simur, which is a sort of a symbol for the divine, and they slowly sort of drop away, and it's too difficult, and they stop. And then at the very end, only 30 birds actually reach the simur, and then you find out that when they see the simur is a reflection of themselves, and you realize that simur actually means 30 birds. And so this idea of the divine being a reflection of you, and I think that for me was really just touched me, as someone who is trans and Muslim, and it's searching for the divine in my own life in various ways, and wanting to write a character who's doing the same thing. This idea of like, well, if I could write about the divine being a reflection of someone like me, what would that look like? Or what would the search look like? What would it look like not just for one character who's trans or queer, but a lot of different characters in a lot of different times? and that's why, you know, that because that search is so prevalent for so many characters, that is what ultimately made the birds sort of appear and then proliferate all over the place.
Yeah, once you start looking at birds, they're everywhere. I bring my students bird photographs to class, just as like I hand them out, and then they start to text me, I just saw a robin. Like they have not, like you don't notice that world, and then suddenly it is everywhere. And I loved the way that happened beautifully in the book. So it was really great. Yeah, I guess just shift a little, which is thinking a little bit about provocation. And I thought I'd do it sort of specifically, and then maybe we would pan out into the meaner, nastier world of where we are with kind of where we are as a culture. And I'm getting some message here. Oh yeah, this is not to me, it's to the audience. Okay, they're supposed to drop. I was like, am I supposed to drop a question? And I think I'm asking them. So I want to talk about provocation, and I have to start with you, Torrey, because like I just remember seeing the title of your book before. I was like, what? And the title of your other. Clearly you know how to do a provocative title, and it's it's either. I suppose it was either a risk or a magnet, right? Like, oh my God, must read immediately. Like, what the hell is this? But I'd love for you to talk about that provocation of detransition as the title, and then sort of taking that on in the book, in a way that I haven't seen done in that way. So I wonder, was there any pushback? Was or just how it evolved for you?
Yeah, there was pushback. Categorically, there was pushback. There was definitely, both trans people didn't like it and bigots didn't like it. And that feels good to me. If I'm pissing off both sides, it probably means that there's something happening. One of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to take back that word. In order to detransition, you first have to transition. So detransition belongs in some ways to trans people. It's an experience that looms for us that doesn't loom for other people. And so that means that I don't want to cede it. I don't want to let it get weaponized against trans people and be like, well, this is the story that gets used against us and we never get to touch it, because if we touch it, everybody will say, see, detransitioning, detransitioning, detransitioning. Trans people, if you transition, your life is going to be filled with regret. You're going to regret doing this, whatever the narrative is. I wanted to take it back. But also I wanted to sort of say, so what? The narrative about detransition is that, okay, you transition, you decide you've made a mistake, and now your body, the myth is that you're deformed for the rest of your life. In fact, that's not the case. Many people transition and then they go backwards a little bit and they live very happy lives. They've found a place that makes them happy. And then thirdly, even on top of that, let's say you do regret. To that, I also want to say, so what? Many people do things in life that they then regret. You move across the country for a job. The job doesn't work out. You don't say to people, well, we're not going to let anybody move across the country for jobs. That's not the way it works. You say, well, it didn't work out. You come home, like maybe with your tail between your legs, and you try again. But what's happening with concepts like detransition is that instead there's shame around it. There's silence. So when people come home, in the metaphor of the job across the country, they're essentially shunned. And so by talking about detransition, by saying, here's a detransition story, the reasons that people detransition are varied. Usually it's just that life as a trans person is hard, but let's even just give you all the other possibilities. Let's talk about it, so that when somebody detransitions, so when somebody says I transitioned, I tried a binary gender, maybe I went, because my character Ames doesn't go exactly back to being the man he was before. It's not like, oh, you've betrayed the trans community or something like that. Let's just have it be a flourishing of conversation. And in order for things to flourish that way, I think you have to speak shame. You have to say the things that are supposedly unsayable. And then once you say them out loud, you realize they're not that big a deal. It's like that's how shame works. You say it, you say the thing you're ashamed of, and then you can look at it, you can pick it up, and you're like, not that big a thing. So a lot of my work, especially where shame is involved, it's not provocation for the sake of provocation. It's provocation for speaking the thing that I feel should be said, so that it can be dealt with, so that it can be examined, so it can be discussed, and so that people aren't living in pain around these concepts, and that these concepts aren't weaponized in all sorts of divisive ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it raises such a great question for any artist who gets. I mean, I think every artist now is being boxed into singularity of identity, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But but particularly when you think about transitioning, I mean, there's a lot of, as I would say, flux in what that word means. And and any of you can address this, but I wonder, how you deal with this idea of flux because what transition, of course, suggests is destination, right? And so what detransition is like, oh, it was the wrong destination. Well, I mean, not necessarily. What's the right destination, right? There's no, where are we actually going? And so my own argument would be we have a lot of problem with the idea of flux in the culture. You have to sort of know where you are all the time. And so I just sort of wonder how that, to what degree do you feel that pressure in your writing in terms of representing, and in what, and the ideas that your thoughts about all of these subjects will be in flux, and how do you hold that, and then also feel like consistently you have this voice that you trust and can write from. So
should I take that one, or
go
should
ahead
I
and
pass it on?
it's great.
Yeah. Well, as I was writing, I began to think as much about affinity as I did identity, because I think identity is oftentimes politically determined. It's something that, this is what this identity is, this is what this identity is. And then you can get locked in, and you're supposed to follow various cultural scripts for various identities. But affinity was very useful to me. So for instance, my book is dedicated to divorced cis women. And the reason I dedicated my book to divorced cis women is I actually think that there's an affinity between trans women and divorced cis women, in that you live your life a certain way with certain expectations, and then there's a break or a failure, and you have to move forward without reinvesting the illusions that brought you to that failure, or getting bitter. And so when I hear conversations by divorced cis women, I'm like, oh, you're asking the same questions that I'm asking. Oh, we have affinity. There's an affinity between us. And that affinity means that actually we can have a conversation. It breaks a sort of stay in your lane mentality. It breaks a kind of cultural script. And so my answer to this is not to sort of like complain about identity, but to say, yes, identity and other things, to move flexibly. Affinity, humor, play, like all these things will get you around that stuff. And that's what I enjoy in other people's work, especially trans authors.
Cool. Zeyn, Neon, thoughts about that question? Yeah.
I can talk a little bit about that. I mean, I thought a lot as I was writing this book about the space where you are sort of, how do I say this, where you're not yet arrived, and maybe figuring out that you're never going to sort of arrive in the sense that other people expect you to. From a particular perspective of not identifying with a binary gender, but in a lot of other ways as well. And one of the ways it shows up in this book is that for most of the novel, the narrator is unnamed. And I initially, got pushback on that, and had to sort of figure out, like, well, okay, I mean, there's a lot of, canonical examples of unnamed narrators. Why is it that as a trans writer with a trans narrator that I'm getting pushback about that from cis readers? And also, if that makes me feel a certain kind of way, then what do I do with that feeling? And what I decided to do was I decided to just erase the name. And so what happens is that in all the chapters, until that character chooses a name, they're actually erased by hand. It looks like this on the page, where there's just a scribble where the dead name would be. Because I was sort of like, yes, I want the character to live in this like in flux state, and I want the reader to be sort of forced to be in that space with him. And also I want to draw attention to the fact that that sort of state of flux makes some readers uncomfortable. And I want them to like sit with that and be like, why am I uncomfortable with this? What would it feel like for me to be in this space for a while? Not just for this character, but maybe are there places in my own life where I'm in flux in this similar way? And that space of flux can be, rather than simply being uncomfortable, can actually be a space of possibility and can be like a generative space, let's say. Or a place where healing can happen. And I think that goes beyond just trans people. I mean, I think that can apply to lots of different people and situations. So I think, I don't know, I tried in this book, and I think in a lot of my work lately, to like lean into that and to be like, okay, in a similar way to what Torrey said, I think, like if it's something that makes me uncomfortable or makes someone else uncomfortable, or there's shame around it, around not being sort of presentable in a way that I'm supposed to be or expected to be, maybe that's actually a place where I want to sit with that feeling rather than trying to escape it.
Yeah. Neon, thoughts on that question?
So I think that I actually really like the idea of writing to affinity rather than just identity, because I think over the past few years, I have had a lot of thoughts about writing as, a marginalized person in many axes, being not American and not white and non-binary and stuff. And the feeling that like writing to specifically only to my identity has turned me this, educator, tour guide, and sort of like a spokesperson for all the different identities that I represent. And honestly, that's a lot to ask of any one person. And for me, I think like the book that I have coming out this year is it's not quite a secondary world fantasy, but science fiction. It takes place in the far, far future with people who are like descendants of people who left Earth on like a generation ship, and it's not a book where I put a lot of myself as a person into it, but I put a lot of my thoughts about things that are happening around us into with regards. It's a lot, in a way, it's a lot about a book about truth and conspiracy and self-radicalization and things like that. And I think for me, I want to write more about things that I'm thinking, that rather than things that I am, if that makes sense. And it doesn't, and the two don't have to be entirely separate, because who I am reflects and affects what I think about things that are happening in the world. And I think that's kind of how I navigate writing as a person of multiple marginalized identities, because I don't also want people from the majority to read my books and think like, oh, all people who share your identity think like this, or all people who share your identity are like this, which is like not a fair judgment to make whatsoever. So that's kind of how I've kind of balanced sort of like, the obligation I almost feel as a marginalized person to write, to sort of like explain the marginalized experience to people who aren't, and what I personally want to write as an artist,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, I mean, I think you're getting at something, and I kind of want to, as we have a few more minutes here before questions, I want to get into, which is, you're talking about wanting to write what you want to write, more or less, right? And not what you feel like you're supposed to write, or And I've been in this very interesting situation. I adapted my book into a play, and some theater side ought to produce it, and I raised it. I want to talk a little bit about authenticity. So this weird thing has happened where I am for over a year now, we've been trying, the people want to produce it, COVID slowed that down, but we've just been trying to read it, right? And so so far, we have not it's taken a year, we still have not been able to read the play aloud because no one will cast it. The reason that no one will cast it is because the casting people in the theaters are cis people, and they will not cast trans because they are not trans. So my play has just been sitting, right? Because there's a notion of authenticity. And so then I got a bunch of resumes of casting people who were either trans or non-binary. And I found on one of those resumes that the person specialized in authentic identity casting. And I thought, what is an authentic identity? And then what's my authentic identity? And I've been kind of just pondering that notion of authenticity, which is a word that I used to use in a different kind of way, like somebody being real, right? But real would be complex, right? Not singular. And so I just, wonder how you think about that question of being authentic in your writing, given these kind of what I think are very bizarre, as you're saying, kind of bizarre expectations of what other people think it is for you.
That's a very interesting question. In terms of authenticity, that's actually a thing that I think about a lot, because people always, like, especially if you're like a marginalized person, people talk about the authenticity in your books a lot, but like in any marginalized identity, you will find a range of experiences. Which one of those experiences is authentic? And the answer is like, it's kind of like a question that you can't answer, especially when you're talking about somebody who's writing about, like, an identity they have, because like what's authentic to one person may ring its false to another person from that same identity. And so for me, I think like authenticity, as what you said, is like, being real with yourself. And I think like for me, it's a lot about emotional fidelity, writing something that feels true to you, and how, and also as a writer, as an artist, you have to learn to let go of the story once it's out of your hands, because in the hands of the reader, it's going to become a different story than what you thought you were writing, because everyone interprets the stories they read differently based on their own experiences. And you have to learn to sort of like let go of your story and let it become what it will become in the hands of the readers. And it might be a completely different thing than what you thought when you started writing. And that's just kind of like the nature of art. And that's kind of basically how I'm navigating it personally in my head, that I write what I want to write, and I make sure that at the end of the day, what I'm putting out is like, okay, this is what I wanted to put out into the world. And however it grows and develops after I've done actually shaping it is its own thing, and I don't have control over that, and that's fine.
Great. Yeah, Zeyn, Torrey, either of you, authenticity?
Oh, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think that I probably would have answered this question differently a few years ago, but I think now I kind of think authenticity is a trap for a number of reasons. I mean, I think for one thing, it's sort of like, are white authors asked to, like, whether their story is authentically white, or cis authors, like, is your story an authentically cis story? Like, no. It sort of like comes from the lens of dominant culture. And so that trap, unfortunately, puts you in a space where instead of writing about a very specific person or group of people, you're asked to write about a sort of generic person, or a person who sort of ticks certain boxes, and that often I think in my own experience, just prevents you from writing people who feel like people, which is central to any good work of fiction. So I don't think it's like a useful thing to think about when you're writing. I mean, I think a much more useful question, or not question, I think a much more useful sort of way to think about the craft of making characters is just to be curious and to be specific and to be like, okay, well, I want to know people as they actually are, not as they're supposed to be. And I want to know myself as I actually am and not as I'm supposed to be. And if somebody who is not me and doesn't share many, let's say, traits with me or experiences with me, somehow thinks that I should be something else, like, well, that's as Neon said, like, that's out of my hands, and it's not really going to be helpful for me in crafting my story anyway, so I might as well just let it go.
Yeah. Torrey, your thoughts on that question?
I think Zeyn Neon said pretty much everything I feel, perhaps better than I could have said. So thank you both.
Yeah, I mean, and then I guess, we're, a minute or so from questions. I guess anything that you wanted to ask each other, or anything that's come up that you want to kind of draw from in this conversation. I just want to make sure that everybody, like there's something I kind of wanted to say and I haven't said it, and you get a chance to do that. Otherwise, I have some great questions up here on this slide, but anything that I missed many things in my questions, but there's a lot, so. Yes, Torrey, take it, please.
I'll just say to people who are interested on that question of elders, as you now have been an elder 3 times this week, that I think that this has been a preoccupation in a lot of trans art over the last decade. And I'll just take this opportunity to kind of mention some of the art that has been done around that, where to sort of, for people who are interested in this generational question, what's going on with trans people now, what were trans people doing for the last 50 years. You have artists like Zachary Drucker doing movies with people who were at Stonewall, Miss Majors, the 3 women from the Factory girls from Andy Warhol's time. You have the recent documentary Framing Agnes by Chase Joint and Morgan Page, who talk about the UCLA medical clinic where doctors had collected trans stories, and Morgan M. Page's podcast, One from the Vaults. That's just sort of it's great. It's kind of just gossip, like historical gossip about trans people. So I think if you look out there now, the sort of the archive is being filled in, which for me I'm happy about, because it allows me to sort of like look at this moment. Like I appreciate that there's so many people doing different things, but on that question of where we're trans people, for the audience, if that's something that interests them, I recommend all of those things, because they are beginning to fill in those questions so that artists like us can build on those things, and as these artists have also already done.
That's great. Yeah, I think, and always that stuff is undiscovered, and then suddenly sort of like in the moment of the Black Lives Matters protests, when all of these wonderful books suddenly made the New York Times bestseller. They were out there for 10 and 15 years, and all of a sudden, I think that that it's not like these stories, people haven't been telling them, and in different ways in different places, and we're I think in a place of both discovering and making at the same time, which is exciting. So Zeyn, Neon, any couple of final thoughts before I ask some questions from the audience? Nope. All right, good. All right, so I'm going to go to the Q&A up here. Can you all see the Q&A, or is it just me? So I'm going to read the Q&A. The first question, going off something Torrey said, but anyone can answer the question. How do you feel about non-trans or non-queer authors writing trans characters trying to tell trans stories? Because assuming a trans audience raises the bar and benefits every reader, should works mainly by non-trans authors be written in partnership with trans authors, editors, etc.? Just curious, because in writing classes, I hear a lot of people trying to fill this space, but not sure how to respond.
Well, I'll say something about that, which is that, like, I think there's this idea of that trans people are policing that stuff, or that we're the ones who are screaming about you can't do this or that. And I think anybody can write anything. The question is whether or not you can write it well. So what I said about that is that if you're going to talk about hormones, you have to say something that even trans people don't know. And I think the difficulty for a cis person is to tell a trans audience something about being trans that trans people don't know. However, and so it's a question of quality, not a question of identity. If you are a cis person and you can tell me something about being trans that I don't know, I would love to read your book. I will blurb your book. I'll do anything you want for that book. There's no identity litmus test to tell these stories, but there's a quality test. And that experience and having experienced things allows you to write a higher quality of work, in my opinion. So, if your students can do it, go for it. But they may also discover that that trans people are quite bored, or that they've gotten things wrong, and that's you have to live with the consequences of having written something that's wrong. And there's no way around that. That's what writing is. If I write something bad, people are going to tell me.
Yeah, Neon, Zeyn, that's responsible.
I feel like Tori hit it out of the park. I mean, that was like, the only thing I can add beyond that is to say that, like, unfortunately, cis people writing about trans people can be wrong, and cis gatekeepers often won't know the difference, and, their work can make it quite far. And while getting things wrong in the text, which is unfortunate. And so, like, that, sort of caveat is always there too, of just like, you don't know what you don't know if you're not writing about your own experience, which, again, as Tori said, that doesn't mean that you can't do it. There's nobody's telling you like, oh no, you absolutely can't write something. It's just, knowing what the risks are of doing that, and of, that not only you may get something wrong, but you may not even realize it, and that, the people who have the power to then publish you may not even know it either. So it's complicated.
Yeah, I agree with both Tori and Zeyn, what they said, because I think, like, anyone, I mean, I don't think there should be like policing of like whether who can write what, but always understand that if you're writing from an identity that you yourself haven't lived through, that the onus on you will always be a lot greater, because you're coming from a perspective of an outsider. And as Zeyn said, you don't know what you don't know. Like, you don't really have that base of experience to work off of. So you have to do like a lot more work. And like, if you can actually write something that contributes to the discourse or knowledge in general, I mean, like, that's great. Just go ahead, do it, as what Tori said. But yeah, it's always going to be a lot more work, and something that you will have to deal with is also people will look at your work a lot more critically, because they understand that you're writing from a perspective that is quite different from your own, and you will have to learn to deal with that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd throw out a little provocation there with, like, but also I think trans people might get it wrong for other trans people, I mean, so I mean, I think that's always the difficulty, right, of what we know. And I mean, the assumption that the four of us know more about something, we might, but it might be really different, right? And so I think that question of that question is a complex one in that way about who gets to write what and who's representing in a way that is, accurate, and sometimes that's a simple question of accuracy, and sometimes it's, I think, more complex. But anyway, just something I'm thinking about. Yeah, Torrey.
I'll just say that when trans people get it wrong, we tell each other. There's no like mafia that's like keep it quiet. Like I got lots of pushback from trans people on my book,
Yeah.
and that's like a lot of people, the experiences I described aren't mine, and I try to be careful to basically be like, this isn't this isn't a universal representation, and I like to push back on the burden of representation. But also, even between trans people, I mean, we are quite critical of each other's work. We do let each other know when we think something is wrong, and sometimes it's almost even more charged within trans discussions. And so then a lot of what cis people then discover when they write from that identity is they're not getting a special, like, extremely harsh attack. They're getting the exact same attack that we do to each other. It's like, welcome to the trans conversation, like the gloves are off. And if you can't hang in that conversation, well, I don't know what you expected. Like, look at how trans people talk to each other. And then if you like that, well, jump in. But if it's too much for you, don't have done it. It's like, I don't, if you, yeah, I mean, spend a day on trans Twitter, go then decide if you want to write a book. So
you mentioned that word earlier, scarcity, right? And it's, so I think that battle inside of, I mean, exactly right. I mean, I think trans people are taking each other on just as much as they're taking on cis people in terms of what is, the agreed upon representations, and what can be discussed and not. And in your case, Torrey, with the book, when you say pushback, do you mean I just want to, like, pushback as you were writing, or like people that just write you and say, how could you have written about Detransition like that, how could you have done that, or something like that? And I'm just curious how, if it's present tense or if it was something you're trying to work out in the writing.
Present tense, past tense, future tense, I'm sure, like,
I assumed that, but I just, I just
Well,
wondered if there was 100% consensus that you did it okay.
No, and if I got 100% consensus, I probably wrote something bland. It's just like, I'm ready. It's like, this is part of the experience, and everyone on this panel knows that that's part of the experience, is wrangling with that in a public sphere where people will tell you that they don't like what you did, and that they feel personally implicated by what you did by dint of identity.
Yeah. I'm going to do another question. And as an aspiring screenwriter, I've consistently struggled with developing trans characters with their own trauma and experiences, but I've also found writing to be a valuable outlet for exploring and processing my own experience as a trans woman. Does there exist a proper balance between these two mentalities? And if so, how does one cultivate that balance?
So I think personally that there isn't sort of like a standard agreed upon certified balance for these things. It's a very personal question that has to have a very personal answer. Like, what is your level of comfort in writing parts of yourself and your own trauma in like the works that you create? For some people, they don't want anything to they don't want that parts of themselves in their work, and for others they just want to put everything in. And I don't think there's the correct answer for what is too much and what is too little. It's just basically, how much are you comfortable with putting in? For me, I'm like, it's like a bit, half of it, I don't know,
I think It's a really thorny issue. I think it's hard for a lot of writers, maybe for all writers. What I will say is that, I did recently have an experience where I decided to kind of write about something that had actually happened to me in the broad sense, and then to take it and make it, put it in a completely different context for a completely different kind of character. But what I found in doing that was that, like, you have to get a lot of distance from something that is upsetting or traumatic before you can actually write good fiction about it. I think that's I can really only answer this in terms of fiction. For now. I just think that it's very difficult to, without a lot of time and processing and maybe therapy, at least for me, therapy has been super important. I find that, like, I need a certain amount of distance from something to be able to actually write about it in any kind of way where it's going to make good fiction on a craft level. And that often means that, like, the processing of the thing has to happen on a separate track, as without an expectation of making it into fiction, and just, like, let that take however long it takes and do whatever needs to be done to let that happen, without expecting that someday I'm going to make this into a story. Because if I'm looking at it with my sort of writer, fiction writer hat, then I'm not allowing myself the kind of space I actually need to heal from it, potentially. I just personally, I don't think those things can happen at the same time. So that for me is the difficulty.
Anybody else want to respond to that before? All right, in that case, first of all, I just want to thank all three of you. It was such an incredible pleasure to prepare, to interview you. Of course, just remarkably talented, and again, in ways that were so distinct. And it was such these are the kind of panels of, like, oh yeah, I get to prepare for this. Does this work? This is, like, great fun. And so thank you for that. And for Penn Faulkner for having us all here. And I cannot recommend these books enough to all of you out there. It's just terrific writing, and provocative, and just smart and fun. So I really enjoyed all of the reading. I'm going to now introduce the executive director of Penn Faulkner. Happens to be somebody that I've known for at least, I don't know, 20 years, Gwydion Sullivan? Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so we met in a bar. No, not really. It was a coffee shop. We had coffee, right, about 20 years ago. So anyway, Gwydion is going to take it from here, and thank all of you and the audience for joining us. So.
Hello, everyone. I am, as Carl just mentioned, I'm Gwydion Sullivan. I'm Penn Faulkner's executive director. And I, too, want to offer my tremendous thanks for all of our generous guests and our spectacular moderator, and to all of you, too, who are here in the audience for making this another incredible literary conversation. What a humbling reminder it was of how stories, both writing them and reading them, are such a powerful way of discovering and recreating the self. And at the same time, being able to have this conversation together, even in this virtual space, is such a meaningful way to be a self in community with others. And we couldn't do any of that without your participation, all of you. So I am so very grateful. I wanted to close tonight by mentioning that Penn Faulkner works really hard to give students in grades 3 through 12 who attend low-income schools in DC experiences just like this one. Reading and writing and meeting authors, they help students discover themselves and reinvent themselves. And the books we donate help keep them connected to a larger world and survive difficult circumstances, just like they do for all of us. So I've asked to have our donation link dropped into the chat. And, I just want to say, even $5 from you can help one young person see themselves as they are and see their story reflected in literature. And for $5 a month, if you can manage that, it helps us do the same thing over and over again throughout the year. Penn Faulkner has continued to stay strong and to stay hopeful. And part of what has given us that hope and that inspiration is all the support we've gotten from you. So thank you so much in advance for anything you can do. And thank you again for joining us tonight too. Again, we're very grateful. Have a great night.